All right, so we've got a question from a student, Inquiring Minds. Where does the scientific aspect of writing and bias show up in math? Just as a recap, scientific aspect of writing deals with how people engage with knowledge, confirming, challenging, creating, discovering, communicating. And bias is going to be something that is based on our existing beliefs or understandings of the world. So when we're kind of mashing those up in a math class, there's a couple of places where math can actually be really good for making bias more explicit. When we're defining variables by very specific contexts, that forces us to say, well, what are the assumptions we're making about this data? We have to make assumptions that, if we're using math and science, that things are happening at some sort of standard temperature and pressure, STP. And so then we zero out certain things, or we put a core value in. But that's a bias implicit, that's a bias that we're being explicit about because we're contextualizing our experiment or whatever it is. If we're looking at other parts of math, if we are declaring or naming our variables in ways that aren't very specific, we can mean one thing. Say we say P equals the number of people who shop on a Monday, but we really mean the people who shop at Target on a Monday, and we're not. So the bias can be embedded in our ambiguity by accident. So we've made assumptions about those things, and until someone comes and says, wait, you said this is people, is this all people, is this some people, is this certain types of people, so what does this variable actually measure? And so at least trying to be explicit when we're naming variables and specific forces us into a place to engage with some of those biases. So that's important. That's good. Other places is when we are looking at graphs and data, bias can show up in the way things are presented, because we can create data that makes the graph or the line or the slope on something seem more extreme than it is. If you're really talking about the differences or the increase in from 80% to 90% of anything, for instance, your graph could show from 0 to 100%, or your graph could show from like 78 to 95%. And depending on what you're trying to say, someone could make the graph look like the difference between 80 to 85 or 85 to 90 is a substantial difference, when in reality it's 5%. But when you're looking at the graph, it may visually feel like it's half of the graph because of how you design it. So those are just some quick ways that bias and the scientific aspect of writing might show up in math, just as a starter.